Machiavelli isn't actually that bad of a leader. We need to bring back more human subjects in psychology testing. You know, Stanford prison experiment style. These are just a few of the hot takes I've heard come from devil's advocates. You know, those people in a conversation who are always bringing up unpopular opinions for the sake of angering or provoking others. Now, when we encounter these types of people, we have some options. We could give the devil's advocate space to react before we react. We could also just exit from the conversation. But overwhelmingly, our most common response is to disagree immediately and vehemently. In today's climate, many of us would prefer to defend a held belief than to consider alternative opinions, let alone admit we might be wrong. This doubling down of our own stance is particularly intense when competing views threaten or invalidate our very personal experiences. On a larger scale, these individual interactions compound, contributing to the overall increase in polarization measured in virtually every social, economic, political, and cultural sphere. But I believe an important kind of learning takes place when we lean into these types of conversations without initially assuming any side has malintent. When we take the time to understand how our psychologies impact how each of us perceives truth, we can be better, more productive participants. So, what can we do to be more open-minded during these difficult dialogues? Beginner's mind. I first encountered beginner's mind as a Columbia undergrad, where one of our college's core competencies included this Zen Buddhist principle. It's defined as the idea of engaging with the world without preconceptions, as if you're seeing everything for the very first time. I interpret beginner's mind as a learning perspective, one that inspires me to be infinitely curious and approaching each engagement with humility. What makes exercising beginner's mind so difficult is that registering information that conflicts with their existing beliefs is, at best, somewhat uncomfortable. Beginner's mind also requires us to be aware of how we think, which is often governed by subconscious processes. At the same time, devil's advocates can sometimes be less advocates for underrepresented opinions and more so bigots, disguised as legitimate arguers. At its worst, beginner's minds could be interpreted as justification for debates on topics that are simply not debatable. But beginner's mind changes the trajectory of conversations. It encourages us to engage with others, not with the goal of mutual agreement, but with the goal of mutual understanding. So today, I want to share 3 cognitive biases that an awareness of can help you have better, more genuine engagements. Human psychology explains how each of us can be given the same information, yet come to conclude drastically different things from it. When we acknowledge how our psychology both unites and divides us, we find humanity in having differing agreements, and we can better pursue beginner's mind. When meeting somebody for the first time, you might be asked, or be the one asking, "What's your star sign?" Me? Oh, I'm an Aquarius. If you're born between January 20th and February 18th, you are too. Any fellow Aquarius signs out there? Us Aquarius are natural-born leaders, charismatic and generous people, but we can be arrogant and histrionic at times. Overall, though, sounds pretty good, right? Maybe that feels pretty accurate for some of you? Well, I hate to break it to you, but these characteristics are actually attributed to Leo signs, and they're about the opposite of what us Aquarius signs are actually supposed to be like. Oftentimes, we think astrology readings are scarily accurate because we're mentally cherry-picking the information that flatters us and in which we might already believe. Astrology readings are one very common example of confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is defined as a tendency to search for information that confirms our existing beliefs and to discount, forget about, or even ignore information that doesn't. Why does confirmation bias persist? Well, cognitively speaking, it's easier to process information that aligns with our existing beliefs. Otherwise, what we learn could undermine our existing knowledge, our identity, our self-worth. And who wants that? At the same time, it feels great to be reassured you're right, even if it means you tend not to question why a social norm or status quo is the way it is. Confirmation bias is limiting in difficult conversations because it restricts the perspectives you can consider. To entertain information that supports only what you already believe to be true means we undervalue competing opinions. Beginner's mind is about adopting a balanced approach to seeking out information to inform our opinions. When you find yourself in a frustrating encounter and in conflicting views, I encourage you to validate your feelings and to elaborate on your thoughts in the conversation, as opposed to first going on the offense. Beginner's mind is also about destigmatizing the process of being wrong. We have to be both willing learners and generous teachers. Teachers who understand that real conversations are ones that encourage others to be receptive to information that to them seems untrue. Recognizing our tendency towards confirmation bias is essential in helping us authentically listen and thus in pursuing beginner's mind. Let's move on to hindsight bias. We're told hindsight is 20/20, that our retrospective view on a situation is going to be clearer than when we're actually experiencing it. While this principle may be true with a whirlwind romance where you don't see the red flags until the relationship is crashed and burned, our imperfect memory systems make hindsight a bit more complex. Have you ever read something new, taken notes on it, and at the end of it thought to yourself, oh, that was easy, I already knew all that information? Or picture this. You get back an assignment that you were really confused about while you were completing it. But then you look and see that you actually did really well. And suddenly you realize, oh, I knew that wasn't that hard. I knew it would be all along. Well, if either of these scenarios sound familiar to you, you may have fallen victim to hindsight bias. Hindsight bias refers to how learning something new impacts our memory of the time before we learn that information. Hindsight bias means it's hard to recapture the ignorance and uncertainty we once had before we learned something. Hindsight bias can hold us back in two main ways. It can prevent us from learning from our past selves and from empathizing with those who are in the positions we once were. Thoughts and phrases like, why is this so hard for you to understand? It wasn't for me. Or, back in my day, this wasn't a big deal. Patronize someone else's learning experience. Because we ourselves don't perfectly recall our past ignorance, we discount how people in their learning stages may feel. Recognizing our hindsight bias can help us create more compassion while each of us practices our beginner's mind. It can help us appreciate our journeys to understanding, rather than take our current knowledge levels for granted. Who we are today is the result of the triumphs and the failures we've encountered. If we don't reflect on what helped us persevere through those difficult moments, our ability to change from the past and empower one another's learning is limited. If you have the ability to, I encourage you to think about the alternative ways your life could have turned out, and to recognize the resources that made your actual outcome possible. When you next find yourself in a frustrating encounter, consider giving your counterpart the allowances that you once benefited from. We enable one another's beginner's mind when we acknowledge and even honor our past naivete. Let's carry on. Has anybody ever heard of the cooking show Chopped on the Food Network? 4 professional chefs are competing head-to-head to transform a basket of random ingredients into a presentable dish, all in under 30 minutes. It is a nerve-wracking watch. I am constantly yelling at the TV, telling the chefs to hurry up, that they forgot to plate their hastily made ice cream, and that key ingredient was definitely not transformed enough. In my head, I'm thinking I could totally compete on Chopped. Meanwhile, I struggle to just fry an egg. Overconfidence bias is the cognitive tendency to overinflate our self-ability. We know confidence in learning is very important, as it encourages us to attempt challenging things. Confidence helps us dive into the deep end, for better or for worse, and we align it with the fake it till you make it mentality. Confidence helps us remain resilient. But the line between confidence and overconfidence is fine. If our perceptions of our ability are much higher than our actual ability, we may act and feel competent in realms that we are absolutely unqualified to speak about. Should you really be advising others on that risky investment when you have very little financial expertise? Should you really say you're proficient in Excel when you know only basic formulas? Did I exhibit overconfidence bias when I agreed to give this talk? You can be the judge of that. The reality is, when we approach conversations arrogantly, we believe we have all the answers and are privileged to have the final say. This mentality is antithetical to beginner's mind. To look at the world without preconceptions includes being honest about our current beliefs and abilities. Research shows that overconfidence levels are highest amongst those with average ability. Overconfidence actually decreases as one's expertise increases. And so, particularly when an interaction can improve our skills, we need to be aware of how our subjective ability compares to our objective levels. This accuracy enables us to properly identify our weak points and turn to others in strengthening them. Conversations that normalize respectfully talking about the ways we can each improve enable us to develop, rather than focus on defending ourselves. Beginner's mind is about recognizing our potential to grow and giving credit where credit is due. To bring us back to center, I want to re-emphasize that beginner's mind is a learning perspective that requires communal effort in order to function. We all need to converse and give each other the space and the grace to participate in the marketplace of ideas. Confirmation bias, hindsight bias, and overconfidence bias are just a few of many psychological tendencies that we are all subject to. They help us navigate this very complicated world, but they don't always make it easy for us to be self-evaluative or to think more critically. Yes, beginner's mind can be idealistic at times, and I re-emphasize that some debates don't feel like debates to us because our very existence is being questioned. But when we take a step back and consider the ways our psychologies impact all of our abilities to pursue a beginner's mind, that awareness can help us form more nuanced opinions and humanize disagreement. Thank you.